Good afternoon. Today we shall be discussing John Keats' celebrated narrative poem, The Eve of St. Agnes. The Eve of St. Agnes is usually considered to be one of the most successful narrative poems written in the Romantic age. Within its own limits, the poem is almost perfectly realized with vigorously drawn characters, clarity of detail, a richly evocative atmosphere, and a welcome freedom from what some commentators often charge Keats with, namely lapses of style, inconsistencies, and a certain lack of detail. The poet himself thought rather little of it, perhaps because it seemed to him to reveal inexperience of life and a general tendency towards sentimentality. But most readers of John Keats today would estimate this poem very highly. Saint Agnes was a 13-year-old Christian martyr whose symbol was the lamb. Legend had it that on the eve of her feast day, which falls on 20th January, a maiden who performed certain rituals would have visions of a future husband during the night. Stanza 6 of the poem mentions those rituals, which included going to the bed without supper, not looking behind or sideways on retiring, and lying on the back. The legend was suggested to Keats by a friend, Mrs. Isabella Jones, and other elements in the story were provided by his background of wide reading and by architectural features of the area in which he was then visiting. Now, with regard to the synopsis of the poem, the setting of the poem is clearly medieval, perhaps a Gothic castle in which a bedesman or a holy man performs his prayers and penances while a revelry takes place. One lady, named Madeline in the poem, thinks only of the legend of St. Agnes's Eve and resolves to perform the rituals. Porphyro, who is in love with Madeline, comes in the hope of seeing her, although he and his family are hated by all in the castle. He is met by an old woman called Angela, his only friend there in the castle, who warns him anew of the family's enmity towards him. He begs her for a sight of Madeline, and as she recounts Madeline's plans for St. Agnes' Eve, he resolves to enter Madeline's room and gaze upon her. The old woman agrees to take him there and to provide a feast. Madeline comes to her room, assisting Angela downstairs on the way. As she prays, the moonlight shines upon her through a stained glass window. She undresses and gets into bed. When she is asleep, Porphyro creeps from his hiding place and sets the table with food. Being unable to waken her, he takes up her lute and sings. On waking, Madeline is bewildered at seeing beside her the man of her dreams and speaks of her love for him, scarcely realizing that he is there in flesh and blood. They consummate their love as the storm rages outside. In the morning, Madeline at first fears herself betrayed, but Porphyro begs her to fly with him. They depart from the palace secretly into the storm, and that is how this poem ends. The story is reminiscent in several respects of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, notably in Porphyro's being hated by Madeline's family and having no friend in the castle but an old woman who in role and character resembles Juliet's nurse in Shakespeare. The eerie medieval setting, though derived in many details from actual buildings, recalls the Gothic castles of Mrs. Anne Radcliffe's novels, which perhaps Keats is known to have read. A curious feature of the story is the provision of rich food in Madeline's room. Angela speaks of it as a matter of course, yet there is no hint as to why it was needed, nor does anyone partake of it later on. Keats originally wrote another stanza after stanza 6, in which he explained that the vision would be of the maiden's future husband, offering as sacrifice, all in the dream, delicious food even to her lips brought near. Why he cancelled the stanza is not known. Its absence does leave a slight flaw in the poem's structure, maybe, although the true function of the food in stanza 31 of the poem is only to create an atmosphere. Keats certainly knew the Arabian Nights, whose Eastern stories, in which references to feasting as a prelude to love making, are prolific. This is the preliminary introduction that I had to give you on the Eve of St. Agnes.